thank you very much for that introduction. It's nice to virtually be here on, I think is it day 101 or 102 in the UK, at least in terms of our lockdown, albeit with some concessions happening in certain places at the moment. We're reducing some of that. I'm just going to give you a brief overview, as Ben said, of some thinking around transport and mobility during COVID-19 in relation to aging, from the perspective of older people themselves. I haven't had an opportunity particularly we have had an opportunity to collect some data from some older people, but we haven't had an opportunity to analyze that data particularly yet. So I've really just got what we might call, I suppose, some anecdotal stuff at the moment to introduce things with, along with some survey data from the ONS, Office of National Statistics in Britain, to give an overarching flavour of where we're up to. Of course, this terrible pandemic has been sort of amplified and increased because of the hypermobile society that we have in the world at the moment. Things like increased numbers of airline travel by 137% in the last 15 years. We consider it perfectly normal to do great big long journeys, to work between different countries, to live in different countries, to go on holiday in different places. And it's no surprise that Wuhan, which was one of the early epicenters, albeit possibly one of the first epicenters of this terrible disease, has really good transport links and really good links around from China. From there, lots of people fly into there and then fly out to other places from there, as well as having its own center for movement around there. So it's probably not surprising that amplified things from that as a center. So we know that mobility in general affects how diseases travel, but now we try and stop that by having lockdown in different countries in different ways with different elements of success. We know in the UK that our curtailing of mobility through the lockdown things that we have in place has happened, but we know that doesn't happen particularly very equally. So although the benefits of mobility are unequally distributed, so are the disbenefits when mobility lockdown occurs. And we can see, the lockdown has had some success. So there's reduction in things like people going to work, people working from home or being furloughed. There's a reduction in people going out to recreation and to retail and shops, but an increase in people staying at home and also using local parks and things like that. So you'll see the data there comes from Google Maps, mapping people's journeys on that. But we know that that isn't totally balanced evenly amongst different groups of society. So those who rely very much on mobility for their work, especially where government support is lacking, are finding this particularly difficult and troublesome. People who rely on accessing health regularly or care service or group therapy meetings, a lot of people we work with in our research who perhaps on the early stages of dementia, for example, have some brilliant groups that they belong to, and they're really missing those. Some of them meeting virtually. Some people manage to find that absolutely fine and doing well, but it's not quite the same as meeting in person, as an example. People not connected to the internet or don't have their own devices to do that, it's another issue. Those perhaps in more isolated and rural areas, perhaps because of the internet, but also unable to get to the services and shops easily, and as well as those perhaps in a city centre. And all of those things, as you can see, probably grouped together somewhat to affect older people in particular on those fronts. And we can see that in some of the stuff that we've done talking to older people. There's some interesting research done recently from the Office of National Statistics. They did this across lots of different age groups, and they found that particularly older people were very worried about mobility issues in general. So they worried about their day-to-day travel plans, what they were going to do in order to maintain their well-being. Lots of stuff about not being able to get their essentials in was an initial worry. Some of that has resided and reduced over time. but lots of more issues perhaps about maintaining well-being, and now lots of anxiety about days out and holidays not being able to be taken, all affecting well-being and things like that. So we've shifted perhaps from the sort of utilitarian necessity to more aesthetic or pleasurable things, but still things that affect people's well-being over time. For older people, staying in touch with family and friends was the main way that people had coped with the stresses of being locked down. But it was also that age group, particularly sort of 60 plus, but certainly 70 plus, who had been very much affected by the relationships they were unable to maintain or keep with their family. So on the one hand, it was the thing that kept them together, but on the other hand, it was the thing that was hardest to keep together in order for that to happen, whether that they were doing that remotely or not. Lots of older people were very much used to being close to people's family, to their adult children, to their friends, sometimes as carers for other people in the community as well, and a great big disruption to their day-to-day needs and issues there. And like I said, that particularly early on in it, access to groceries, medication and essentials had been really affected, and that was more than any other age group. So all these together make, living with the lockdown for over 60s and over 70s more troublesome than perhaps for some other age groups. And when you look at mobility, it's troublesome in a number of different areas. It's important to stress as well that older people are not just victims of these things. Lots of them have tried to get involved in helping other people in the community. Lots of them were doing things like this anyway. Huge number of volunteers in 60s and 70s age group can no longer do some of the things they have, and some of them have gone out of their way to go around and helping on neighbours and getting involved in community events. But again, in order to do that, lots of them need their own mobility in order to do that. So again, if you haven't got a car, it's difficult to use a bus, difficult to walk around to these places, perhaps more than ever during lockdown, then this becomes an issue. So things that we'll perhaps build on in a little bit. We're seeing changes in mobility for older people in terms of their active travel. Older people need more room. We all need more room to be able to walk and cycle in the environment. Older people particularly telling me they're very anxious about the normal routes that they might go for their daily walk, or for a walk every other day or so, to perhaps to green areas. Down in South Wales, lots of people going to the beaches and things can't do that at the moment because they feel too anxious about other people coming the other way and not being able to socially distance from them. So the usual routes are perhaps unavailable. Some people making concessions on that and changing their routes and enjoying different ways of traveling, seeing different things, but a lot of them very anxious about it and staying home as a result. There's the impact, of course, of not being able to get out for a while. Lots of people who've stayed in, perhaps shielded in that age group and not been out. Getting going again afterwards is a particular issue. Physically, they're very unsteady, maintaining their sort of skills for driving, for example. But overall, whether you're walking, cycling, using a bus or driving, a lack of confidence along with your physical unsteadiness is another issue that needs addressing. In terms of bus use, and I'll come on to some more details of that in a minute, high levels of bus use amongst that age group as it was, and then huge anxiety over use since things have changed due to changes in timetable or changes in social norms, and again meaning that people are staying home a lot more. So there's that big reduction in mobility, which can result in isolation. A lot more people not doing as much physical activity, not getting out and about and seeing the world, not getting involved in their communities like they have done in previous before lockdown occurred. So just to concentrate on public transport for a few minutes, we've had lots of anecdotal reports from older people around these kind of issues where they're using the bus. So we've had a real mixed response so far. Some people have carried on using the bus throughout the whole of lockdown, regardless of worries or concerns about catching the virus. And the interesting thing is, I think, actually, when talking to older people, very few of them put the concern about catching the virus itself high up. They're much more anxious about the other issues to do with being on the bus now, like the new norms. So For example, do you have to wear a mask on public transport, particularly for some of the older people who've got breathing difficulties, or they've got issues that complications that mean wearing a mask make it more difficult for them to breathe, at least, and therefore not wanting to wear one, and they're then looking like that they're being illegal, as it is in England, or looking like they don't care for other people as a result of it. Some of them, like I said, are very carried on using the bus, but there's a lot of worry and anxiety around it. So some of them haven't used the bus anywhere near as much as they have done before. In fact, some of them haven't used it at all. They've talked a lot about wanting more communication from bus companies to help them with it, whether that's directly from the bus driver themselves. Some of them saying, normally they've been very, the bus drivers, some friendly help to help them overcome some of their anxiety, can chat to them when they get on, but at the moment a lot of the buses have glass shields up. Bus driver doesn't talk to them, so they're anxious and worried about additionally as a result of that. They have social anxiety about whether they should ask people to move seats if people are sitting too close to them. Some of the seats are blocked out, but not all of them. It's natural, I think, for a lot of the older people I talk to want to sit quite close to other older people and sometimes chat to them. That's all out of the window. So all those complete social norms that make using the bus quite pleasurable for some older people are no longer the case. There's also an issue that they shouldn't be using it because they're not a key worker themselves. Even that came from some people who were helping some other people, which actually, is probably a duty of a key worker, whether that's voluntary or not. I shouldn't use the bus. I should leave it for people working in the NHS who need it, especially with capacity being reduced because seats are out of operation. And then there was lots of anxiety, therefore, about it being full. If they go out on the bus and the one coming back is full, and as indeed some of the city centre services have been, how long are they going to have to wait for the next one? There's been changes to running timetables, changes to routes that a lot of older people have got very anxious about, without, again, very much communication from that. There's examples in some of the cities where older people used to go and wait for the bus outside their house. They can no longer do that. Some companies have offered concessions for that. You can phone up and have a bus diverted down your street. Some quite innovative approaches to it, but it's not the same as what people have got used to, or that spontaneous being able to walk out of your house and catch a bus, as lots of people in town and city centres have got used to. Then there's that overall anxiety about the future. When will it ever return to normal? There's this is the normal for now, and that creates great anxiety and worry about it. And interestingly, even for the people using it, these anxieties have not gone away. In fact, some of them are becoming more entranced the more this goes on, rather than it becoming adapting to the new norms, for example. So what we said would be good, the bus train companies, it's mostly buses that we've talked to with older people in the local area, though we had a couple of people use trains. But it is about clear messaging over the new norms and what the new rules are, making sure the bus driver is still friendly, smiles if he can't talk, and makes people feel at ease, where they can talk to communicate with the older people and make them feel at ease, and just having very clear information about timetables and real-time information. When we talked to bus companies, they said, well, if a bus is full and we know there's lots of people waiting, we can put on extra services, especially with the capacity as it is at the moment, with a bit of slack in it. But people need to communicate that with us. Well, I said to them, you need to communicate that with your customers themselves, because they don't know about those kind of things happening. That's really where we're up to at the moment in terms of understanding the sort of new norms around buses. I don't think there's anything additional to add there. So that's probably where I end. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Charles. Does anyone have any immediate questions? Some really interesting perspectives there on social norms related to buses. I know, Ian, you're going to say a bit about buses as well and technology. So let's move on to you.
Okay, so so you need to enable my screen sharing, I think, Ben.
Sorry, Charles, are you controlling the?
Oh, sorry, Charles. Yeah. So we were only discussing earlier on all the possible things that can go wrong in a live webinar session, and we've just discovered a new one. So,
so, Ian, do you know how to do that in Zoom?
No.
I'm trying to find out where it is. I've seen it somewhere. It's not there though, is it? One participant, right? Okay, there are multiple participants can do it. So you should be able to now. Everyone can.
Okay. All chip
Careful
in.
what we put up there.
Great.
There you go.
Okay, so I'm going to talk just very briefly on sort of generally around matters to do with technology and older people's mobility. And I'm going to attempt to bring in the presentation I was going to do at the BSG just in the first couple of slides. So what I was going to talk about originally at the conference was a service called WeGo, which is a demand responsive service that's been running as a pilot scheme here in Bristol. And it's an event-based service. So it makes quite a lot of use of technology in terms of bringing together levels of demand for an event and the booking and the facilitation of the taxi to serve the journey. But actually what's quite important about it is that the technology at the point that the older people are engaged is quite low tech. And it might just actually involve a phone call or talking to a receptionist at the health centre. So basically the service was bringing together people who are travelling to attend a particular event. In this case, it was classes for people with chronic health conditions that were happening at a health centre. And the pilot was going really well. We had about 17 regular users, and we managed to do a little survey with them just before the lockdown started, and some really promising results about how people were finding the service really useful. A lot of people wouldn't have attended the events had the service not been available, and they would have had no other way of getting to the event. So it was starting to look really good, and people were happy that they were sharing with other people because they were going to the same event, and they were happy to divert on their route to take a slightly longer route to pick up others on the way. Unfortunately, then of course we got hit by the lockdown, and the service has stopped completely. So that activity is no longer happening, and we can only start to sort of imagine what impact that might be having on people's not just mental well-being, but also their physical well-being, no longer being able to attend those classes. And it sort of suggests potentially some longer-term implications for what was quite a promising area of research around small-scale, demand-responsive, event-driven modes of transport. So thinking about changing the emphasis, if you like, around how the transport was organised. So picking up on the fact that all of these people are going to this event, why not try and bring them all together? But as Charles was pointing out, issues around public transport, even on an ordinary bus, only so many seats are available now. How do you manage to get social distancing in a 4-seater vehicle or even a 10-seater vehicle? It's just not practical. So you're losing that social interaction that you might have also gained during the journey. And a whole load of issues, as Charles was pointing out, around what does that mean longer term for some of these things. So some other areas of technology that I work in and look at. The last 5 years I've been working on autonomous vehicles, and particularly at the Flourish project, which was a 3-year project looking at autonomous vehicles and older people. And a couple of things have happened during the lockdown that are quite interesting. On the left there, you can see an example in the US where they were using an autonomous vehicle to actually help during the COVID situation. We almost managed to get a trial going here in the UK involving a supermarket and a chemist and delivering to a local neighbourhood in the West Midlands with an autonomous vehicle. The idea being that it minimised the amount of shopping that older people would have to go out and do. Unfortunately, the trial didn't actually come to fruition in the end, but there was a serious attempt to try and pilot something in that area just to show how autonomous vehicles could help in these sorts of situations. And if you get a minute, I'd really recommend looking at the delivery dogs video on the right-hand side. I only came across this recently, but actually it's fascinating. The autonomous vehicle turns up in your street and these dogs just all get out and deliver to individual houses. So you can see how some of this technology in the not too distant future, these dogs are available now, they work now. You know, some of this technology could be really useful in terms of providing some functionality, but what they perhaps all miss out on is that social interaction, that being with other people, that engaging with other people. And okay, maybe you get to like the dog that comes to visit you once a week with your medical supplies, but it's a really interesting sort of vision of where we might be going in a not too distant future. Another bit of technology that is actually happening now as a response to COVID is a lot of bus companies have introduced this bus availability feature into their apps. So you can check before you go to the bus stop whether or not there will be any seats on the bus when you get there. Because of the social distancing, there's fewer seats available. Of course, the problem with that is if you don't use a smartphone or don't have the capabilities to use a smartphone, that's not really helping you. And you may turn up at the bus stop and find out that the bus arrives with a "sorry, I'm full" sign on it. Perhaps another factor that's going to disincentivize people from thinking about using public transport, certainly for the time being. And just another point to think on, the image at the bottom left there, there's an awful lot of information in the front of that bus that's for people with some sort of cognitive issues. There's a lot of stuff to try and process there. So that's just a further factor to think about. So I'm just going to wrap up just some general thoughts around technology and mobility in older people that sort of come out of a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 5 years or so, thinking about technology. We really need to think about what level of technology we're expecting people to use. The WeGo service was really good because people could access that with a really low level of technology. It might just be an ordinary phone call or talking to someone on the reception desk at the health centre. There was a lot of technology behind it, but people didn't have to worry about that. We certainly need to think about incorporating older people's needs in the design and the delivery of all the technology we're thinking about using. It would be great to put a bit more effort into trying to prepare people for some of these new digital technologies. They're not going to go away. They're not going to be put back in the box. You know, the bus app that tells you the capacity is not going to go away. That's there now. So how do we help older people prepare for some of this technology? And how far back do we have to go? Do we need to be talking to people in their 40s and 50s before we even get to these things? There's a little bit about equity of access. Should everything be available everywhere? That's perhaps a more broader question. Should we expect to be having to get to everything from everywhere? Or maybe we think more about where we live and what facilities are available. Yeah, the big picture, we're responsible for selecting the future we want. We're all going to be older people. Some of us are getting there sooner than others, but we are all going to be older people. Sorry, that's my 8 minutes. Oh, bloody hell. Sorry, that's my timer, and my finger doesn't work on that blooming screen. Yeah, so we're responsible for the future that we want, really, and we should think about how we want that to develop, because we're going to inherit that future as well. And yeah, just a final point that while COVID-19 is the immediate issue and it's causing a lot of things to be happening and a lot of technology things are happening as a result of that, those things are not going to go back into the box, and we need to embrace those things and think about how they'll have benefits and uses for older people as we go forward. So slightly overrun, but sorry about the noise.
Thanks, Ian.
Stop screen sharing there.
Yes, please.
There you go.
Yeah. So, gosh, that really got my heart going. The sound of that siren. Simple technology, but very effective.
Yeah.
Okay. Haven't had any specific questions come through on the chat for you, so we'll move on to Rose. If you do have any questions, then do put them in the chat box. Over to you, Rose. Thank you.
Right, I cannot find where I have saved this, so I've sent it to you all. Can you share it for me, Ben or Charles? If you've got that, because I sent you my presentation. It's somehow not appearing. So I wonder if you can do that.
I've got it, Rose. Do you want me to?
Right. Thank you.
No, Ben's got it. Sorry.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. Yes, I don't know what happened to that. Right, good morning, everybody. Right, strange days. In the beginning of this talk, I want to draw on some recent thinking from Matthew Taylor, who's the Chief Executive of Royal Society of Arts. And in a recent article, he was saying that for a crisis to lead to a long-term change, we actually need three things to be in place. Next slide, please. And the first of these was latent potential. And he was asking the question, is there an underlying desire? And importantly, the capacity for things to be different. Well, how long ago was Brundtland? I can't even remember when that was, and there's been so many declarations of international cooperation, and we know things are wrong, we need to work together, but somehow we seem to be muddling along without doing very much. A year or two ago, Greta Thunberg, what an admirable young woman she is, bringing it to a head with climate emergency and the children's strikes. And David Attenborough, and the plastics and all the rest of it. I think a lot of us got a jolt, but clearly we didn't get a big enough one. So through this pandemic, we've seen, that we can rely more on renewable energy, that there is a possibility of different forms of travel, electric vehicles. There's lots of things out there that could be mainstreamed. There are issues of cost on some matters, but it could be different. But of course, for things to be really different, it is down to all of us. As Ian said, we are responsible for selecting the future. We all need to travel less, consume less stuff, and think more about every single decision that we make. Next slide, please. The second is what he calls precipitating factors. Are there aspects of the crisis that reinforce the case? Well, yes. I mean, Charles has been talking about hypermobility spreads disease. I'm sure we all saw the first of the remade Planet of the Apes films, where at the end that flew and you think, gosh, that was prescient. And before we know where we are, by the second film, mankind is an endangered species. It was as easy as that. But it isn't just hypermobility. We've been told stay at home, protect the NHS. Any form of mobility, we've found, we have the potential to take death to somebody else. And you think that's made us all terribly anxious. But think what we've discovered in the meantime. How many of you are actually going to fly across the world for 48 hours to take part in one seminar and you think, I don't think I want to do that anymore. Am I going to travel to London for a 2-hour meeting? You think, why can't we do it by Zoom? Why can't we do these things? travel less, waste less time, and be effective. What about neighbourliness? A few days into the lockdown, we got a note in our door from people we don't know, offering to collect prescriptions, groceries, to be there at the end of a phone line if we were anxious. We had a note in from the local church. We've discovered that neighbourliness. We've discovered, if you want, community love, and it's been brilliant. But we've also found that we can move about in different ways. I think we've appreciated things like Slow City. So you can breathe clean air, you can see the birds, you can identify wildflowers, all of those things, I think, and movement being medicine. Next slide, please. And finally, what Taylor is saying is about alliances and solution. Is there a political will? Are there policies to make things different? This is Grey Street in Newcastle, one of our finest streets in the Georgian Granger town. The City Council is committed to doubling the size of the pavements. This is a historic environment, and you can imagine loads of people going, oh my goodness me, you know, this is going to be dreadful. But things can be done aesthetically in a pleasing way, in ways which don't destroy beauty. We are making room for people, for greenery, and for very little traffic. We can transform our cities into places where we want to be. So those things are happening here, they're happening in many cities, possibly in the cities that you are in. Next slide, please. And for older people, we know the answer to the question, how much are mobility and well-being related? We all know those things. Some recent work of mine in co-motion, older people who'd suffered the most grievous loss of all, the loss of a life partner, were talking about getting out and about as a kind of re-engagement with the world, as a way of moving from that deep grief of isolation and that sense of pain into some reconnection with other people. But how do we promote mobility if we know it's about well-being? How do we do that in ways which keep people safe? And of course, those are the number one questions. Next slide, please. From a planning point of view, we know what we can do because we've already thought about how neighbourhood quality can help stop another big public health crisis, which is social isolation and loneliness. Investment in neighbourhood can help people keep connected and feel a sense of belonging. And these are the things I think which are really frightening. Commercial space, how much of that will be left standing and in good shape when we really, if we ever do come out of pandemic, how much of that will actually be there? Public services have already been decimated by austerity. The little community library, a lot of those are closed or on short hours. Public space, how important that's been. Have you had green space near you? Have you felt able to walk in it? How many local authorities chained up their parks so you couldn't go in? What about community spaces of association? Very important for older people, very important for all of us. An investment in the public realm. We know how to do these things, and we've been perhaps slowly reinvesting. And I think what we need to do is to reinvigorate that offer and to think about making those priorities for investment. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. This was a report in 2018, the Community Transport Association, Institute of Mechanical Engineers, talking about transport, public transport, which I know Ian has talked eloquently about, and Charles. But in my work, and I'm sure in some of yours, what I found was that people didn't just get on the bus to get from A to B. It was the bus community. And particularly in more rural areas, you get on the bus and people greet you by name. The driver knows your name. You know the people there. There's that sense of community which is brought by traveling together. How do we put back social well-being, but keep people safe? What is that sweet point in that offer? Thank you for your attention. And thanks for being slide master there. I don't know what's happened to my...
Thanks, Rose. I'm just trying to reorganise myself. Really good to see the links between the different presentations, and to have that broader overview, I think, in terms of the Matthew Taylor's looking at crisis into change. I'm going to try and refer to that as I go along with my presentation now, on looking specifically at cycling, because I think there's some real echoes there. So let me find my presentation, and please do stop me if I go on too long. I shouldn't really be allowed to chair and present, because I'll just take advantage of that. I'm struggling to get full control of my Zoom. It's the trouble, I feel like I've used about 15 different platforms, all with slightly different functionality. And now I can't find share screen on my own computer. Can you see, have you got share screen for me? Can you see my slides? No.
We can still see Rose's last slide, Ben.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, right. Thank you. Let me.
Okay, now we can see you.
Okay, that's probably enough of that. And here we go. This looks promising.
It's looking better.
Okay, can you see slides now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so thinking about cycling in the UK, we know that levels of cycling by older people are low. So in terms of latent potential, there is very large potential in terms of availability of bikes and skills. And if you compare us with other countries like Germany, they've got 5 to 10 times more cycling by older people. One of the key factors, of course, is about confidence in cycling and feelings of safety on roads. So the study that we did in terms of cycle boom, and this is echoed very widely in other studies, is the need for better infrastructure for cycling, and that there's huge potential in terms of positive experience, health and well-being benefits that have been demonstrated through our cycle boom study and many others. But through approaches to inclusive design, there are multiple benefits to other users of roads, including pedestrians, other cyclists of different ages and abilities, if it's done well. In terms of recommendations from the cycle boom study, we looked at age-friendly cities, and you can see in the centre emphasis on that dedicated cycling infrastructure, low speed zones, reduced motorised traffic levels. And so in many ways, the current situation with the COVID crisis is having an effect on all of those dimensions. So potentially big improvements to levels of cycling. If you look at levels of cycling, the yellow line is for England, the other modes are for GB, and this is all cycling. So you can see the trend line is very strongly up and continuing on an upward trajectory. There's I haven't been able to find much information in terms of breakdown of cycling by age. So it's hard to know exactly who's doing that cycling. But if you look at one of the surveys done by Transport Focus, and coming back to that impact on public transport, on the left-hand side, you've got a quarter of people overall thinking that they're more likely to cycle for journeys where previously they used public transport, but for people 55 and over, that falls down to 12%. But that is still a significant additional number of people, given the low levels of current cycling. Whereas, on the other hand, perhaps more worryingly, look at likelihood to drive for journeys, and people 55 and over, again, that's much higher than the likelihood to cycle. Look at government guidance and funding. I think one of Rose's slides referred to policy and investment in walking and cycling, and that encouragement to walk, cycle or go by car. Slightly concerned about the juxtaposition of the car and the pedestrian and cyclist in that left-hand slide. Some good work that's being done already, and I think Charles has already shown a different bit of this park lane. This must be the Rolls Royce of pop-up cycle lanes in London. Also really good work that's been done in Leicester on the right-hand side. But yeah, significant amounts of money going in short term to the Emergency Active Travel Fund, backed up by guidance, and more money promised, significant amounts later in the summer. Across the country, there have been, even in advance of the investment from central government, there were many schemes which were introduced, pop-up cycling facilities as they were termed, but also speed limit reductions, school streets initiatives, modal filters looking at low traffic neighbourhoods, and so on. So I think what's interesting there is the types of interventions and where they're taking place. So I was going to go to zoom in a bit more detail on Oxford, and coming back to the challenge of modal shift and restriction on bus use, very heavy bus use in Oxford. You can see from this breakdown that further you get away from the centre of the city, the greater reliance on buses. Obviously, this is travel to work, so not the complete picture, but gives you a kind of overview of the reliance on buses in comparison to walking, which drops off significantly after the first couple of miles, cycling a bit more evenly distributed. But if you're reducing bus capacity by a quarter, the initial calculations with 2 metre distancing, not that different with 1 metre distancing, then challenge for Oxford in peak flows is those 95,000 bus journeys being reduced to around 19,000. Different scenarios, if it's people are switching to cars in larger numbers, then we'd be back to huge levels of congestion and pollution in the centre of the city. Bus to cycle, the other extreme, huge numbers with a system that's already quite full in terms of cycling. So broader challenges as far as promoting cycling goes. There have been some issues in terms of that acting fast, working at hyper speed, as Transport for London were describing it, trying to grab road space and make short-term interventions with plastic barriers, some of which had challenges in terms of then ability to walk and cross the road and so on. possible tendency to emphasis more on easy wins rather than where the interventions are actually needed, and questions there about rural links into cities, peripheral communities, as we saw with the high bus use versus in central areas. And the thing that Rose has already touched on in terms of the more traditional arterial routes into the centre of the city versus more local centres and that kind of 15-minute city approach. Coming back to social norms and is infrastructure enough? That's been the main emphasis at the moment, but does more need to be done in terms of behaviour change to support that. There's a danger of those pop-up facilities being popped down again. Already examples of pressure to remove temporary interventions in many parts of the UK. And coming back to what Rose was saying about that political will and priorities, very different response across the country in terms of investing in walking, cycling and taking up that initial offer. And often that's been linked to that existing work that's been done on the ground. So, for example, in Oxford, some areas have been working towards a low traffic neighbourhood approach, and they've been much more likely to be able to have that designed in, capitalise on the opportunity of the money that's available than others who aren't so far down that process. And then just final look at the importance of the existing culture. In Leicester, they've produced a rounded transport recovery plan and had these three principles that I think were really important in terms of safety, sustainability and social equity in terms of driving what they were doing rather than a more kind of piecemeal approach. So I will leave it there and ask for any responses, questions, reflections. I'm aware that we've been very kind of UK oriented, and I know we've got some participants from other countries, and that there's been some really interesting work in. I was listening to a presentation yesterday about the work that's been going on in Milan in terms of promoting walking and cycling. So I'm really interested to hear broader perspectives from anyone on any of the issues raised by the speakers. So, Evangelia, got a question on the chat. Question to Charles. Reduce public transport. Do you think that needs of older population will be neglected, either to give room to the working population, transport needs, or for their protection as a more vulnerable population group for COVID-19?
That's a great question, isn't it? And I'm reluctant to, or afraid to answer that. Yeah, you're probably right. I think that older people themselves already, like I said, there's those few people I talk to who feel anxious that they're taking up space of those that they see as being more worthy, let alone people who aren't older people themselves thinking that. And like I said, one of those older people I talked to was already doing really good caring work for other people, taking things to other people in the community, and didn't want to take up the space on the bus in case it was for an NHS worker. I think that's a fascinating insight, albeit a bit sad, I think, into how people view their a worthy hierarchy, if you like, of whose need is greater than somebody else's on there. So I think at the end of the day, it's really hard to do all of that, but we've already seen, haven't we, during the pandemic in a number of countries, that not only have older people been forgotten about, but the instant reaction, especially in the UK and some other countries, was to shield everybody over the age of 70, regardless of what they were like, or what they were doing, or what they were up to. and gradually that's kind of been relaxed a little bit to those that were seen as more vulnerable and things like that. But that was an afterthought, you know. So yeah, I would say in the first instance, unthinking planning and thought around this will lead to older people's needs being lower down the list, and we need to shout loudly that shouldn't be the case, I think. Yeah, go on, Rose, you can add something.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think what it's going to do is create greater inequalities between older people, because as we all know, a significant proportion of older people drive. You know, Department of Transport might think 70 is significant, but in fact, older people don't. So those who can drive may well get in the car more than they used to, which obviously adds to a whole set of other environmental problems. But time makes most people pedestrians. And I think it's those people who are much more reliant on the public transport offer who are more in danger. But I think we also have long appreciated that as a nation with an aging population, the economy needs older people to be out there. It needs older people to be spending money. So if the economic arguments prevail, we're going to have to find ways of getting people out of their house and into the places where they are shopping, buying a coffee, and all of the other things that people used to do, albeit in safe ways.
Thanks, Rose. Did anyone else have any thoughts along those lines in terms of the?
Cassie had a comment.
Yeah, Cassie, do you want to?
Yeah, hi. There's sort of three areas actually that just has been coming out to me while I've been listening to the presentations, which I've really enjoyed. So thank you so much for pulling this together in the absence of us meeting in person. The first one really came more from Charles's, I guess, and just around the importance of the affective dimensions of mobility. I think the way in which people's emotions are so entangled with how we're moving around now and how that's shifted in recent months is quite interesting. From, you know, I know when you had your hour to get out, it was sort of so joyous, you know, so exciting, and old places that you'd moved around before perhaps brought on different meanings. But I think also so much anxiety and fear that we're not used to as well, with this sort of, what's that phrase, place ballets or something, where you're kind of leaping around the pavement trying to avoid people. So I think that's a really interesting area perhaps to think about going forwards, of how our emotions have become quite scrambled in unpredictable or new ways. I'm working a bit at the moment on weather and well-being. So obviously a lot of this relates to that as well, and certainly the talks around increases in cycling and walking. I think it's important for us to remember this has all been unfolding in this country at least, through our spring and what has been some glorious weather, and I think that's really helped. And again, just in my own work, thinking about how the weather has really impacted people's experiences of lockdown and their desire and experiences when they get outdoors. So I think that's perhaps an area for us to think around as well. And then the final one, I mean, I have less to say about this, but I just wondered sort of the potential or where activism is coming in to some of these arguments. I know there was that example in Bristol of the cycle lanes kind of being painted on overnight by the activist group. So yeah, talking about mobilising that political will, I'd be interested to hear from the speakers around what you think about mobilising activist groups that perhaps haven't taken such an interest in some of these issues before. So yeah, just comments really, but thanks for getting the cogs going. I've had a week of exam boards and Athena Swan, so this I feel like things are starting to oh, this is lovely. Thanks so much.
Yeah, can I just make a sorry, everything's frozen for me. I don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, the screen's all froze for a minute. I was just going to make a comment on the weather aspect there, because I think you're right that we've experienced the lockdown as the weather has been improving, And of course, there's a lot of concern about what happens come the autumn, and whether or not we'll sort of go back into some sort of lockdown situation as a combination of the seasonal flu and maybe the virus will come back again and the impact that might have then in not only will we be restricted in our mobility, and older people will be restricted in their mobility, but we'll also have the weather situation getting worse and overlaying that on top, and I think that could have even more significant impacts on well-being. So just a thought on that front.
And I'd just say one point on the affective component, if you like, of the mobility. The older people I talked to, and it was particularly men, talked about they'd walk to the local shop to get their paper and walk back, and they're not doing that anymore. It's kind of like an excuse for a walk, and they'd walk the long way around sometimes and see things. Now they weren't doing that some more because they didn't want to go into the shop and get the paper, so they were getting other people might deliver it on the way and stuff like that. But that meant they weren't going out at all, even though actually that journey wasn't about getting a paper. It was about going out and seeing the world as it was, and they were really, you know, if candidly they'd talk to me about missing that, but really it was missing the paper, but it was missing the journey itself. And so journeys that were nice and pleasurable, albeit sometimes very short, had become very anxious and full of worry. And I think that was a fascinating change to happen early on. And like I said, with the bus stuff, particularly with the public transport use on the buses, then that anxiety and worry was carrying on. I think that's what's filled in their head when they think of that journey that used to be usually somewhat pleasant. I think that's really interesting, because that, you know, and it's not worry about the virus per se, it's the anxiety that's filled with that journey now, some of which is the virus, but also the social norms, the bumping into people, and it's all become too much. Just fascinating insight. So like I said, I haven't really analysed any of the data yet, but it would be fascinating to look at that a bit more, I think. And activism, I'm not aware particularly of any, although locally there's been a lot of people wanting to do lots of things. First of all, like we said, you know, a lot of people helping neighbours and community for the first time ever, which is brilliant. And some older people telling us that it's the most connected they've ever felt to their community, which is sad in one respect, but good. And we need to hold on to that moving afterwards. And I guess that's a form of activism a little bit. But then there's also lots of people doing things like going out and I don't know, in the local park, litter picking and things like that, because the local council haven't been able to do the bins as often as possible as people are redeployed. There's a lot, again, it's more community work perhaps than activism, but it is quite militant, because they post lots of things about litter droppers online and things like that. And there's lots of shaming of people, and lots of us and them, so youngsters versus older people, and parents versus non-parents and things like, which again, you know, if it wasn't so sad and in such a difficult time, would be fascinating to study, and in-group, out-group kind of things. I wondered if Rebecca had any examples from Manchester, because I know there's been some great groups in Manchester that have done some really good activism around transport before. There was the Graffiti Grannies and a couple of other groups that have been really militant there. But yeah, a bit quieter in Swansea, perhaps.
Rebecca, did you want to come back on that? Can't hear you. Sheila, you wanted to make a point.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm coming up as my name's not going up on the chat. It just says from me to everyone. And I kept thinking, anyway, don't worry. It's just the system. I suppose hello everyone. It's nice to see you all. I suppose I was, well, two things. I've been seen as a vulnerable adult, so I've only just started going for the one walk a day. So mobility's not been 100% on my horizon recently. But I'm very conscious that being a central Londoner, I use my freedom pass all the time. It gets me straight on buses, straight on the underground, straight on local trains, and not just myself as a middle class Londoner, but, you know, across the whole city, we're really missing the fact that we now have to wait hours before we could use it. I haven't used it, but that's not the point. The point is that it's access, and there are a lot of working late people. There are a lot of people in their 60s and early 70s who are still trying to get somewhere to do something. Okay, maybe it's more restricted at the moment. People are nervous. People are nervous of the underground. But actually, my reports to me is very much that there are not that many people on it, depending on the times of day. The buses are, the seats have been taped off every other seats, 2-3 seats. So the London buses are taking 10 people downstairs, 10 people upstairs. So I think the whole confidence building, I know for myself, I haven't even been to our local shops yet. So I don't even know about standing behind lines. I will do. But I think that's also about being defined. I'm not quite 70, but I'm nearly 70. It wasn't that made me the vulnerable person. But there is something about well-being and confidence building and being back out in public spaces that I think is really important. And I think, I mean, in London, London Age UK is campaigning, you know, about the Freedom Pass with the mayor, but you know, there's metropolitan, and then there's London Borough, and then there's local. So going from global to local and local to global is really the point. And I thought that very much strongly listening to Rose. So it would be very good if we had more comparative work. Well, we always say that, don't we? But listening to Charles in Swansea, I'm kind of reflecting on the local and thinking of the comparisons across spaces. And no, I mean, it's really good work. Even I've been on a bicycle, but it's standing here, stuck in its frame in the kitchen, which is not quite the same thing. Anyway, enough from me. I just wanted to make that comment about the Freedom Pass, and actually the finances of travel is important to add to this mix.
Great, thanks, Sheila. We've had a couple of other points on the chat. Maria, you wanted to raise the issue of ethnic inequalities and about minority ethnic older people's use of transport compared with white British populations. Don't know if any of the panel have got any information about that, or Maria, if you wanted to say any more.
Hi, sorry I couldn't unmute my mic. Can you hear me? I just wanted to ask if there's any evidence or research that's also looking at ethnic
Sorry, Maria, I didn't quite. I think I maybe lost the end of your question.
You were very. Your voice is very low. Can you boost at your end?
Hear me now? Better?
No.
Yes.
A little better.
Okay. I was just wondering if there are any thoughts around, because I know Rose suggested something around deepening inequalities, because not all older people will be placed similarly in terms of finances, ownership of car, driving. So, and I'm aware this is not based on any statistical evidence, but more anecdotal about minority ethnic older people being more likely to use public transport because of not being able to drive and not having access to cars. And I was just wondering if there are any thoughts around how this aspect of inequality could affect certain populations more than others.
I think it's an interesting point, if I could just jump in. This is entirely anecdotal, it's not something I've researched, but if I think about Newcastle, which has a very small black and minority ethnic communities and many communities within that umbrella, I mean, obviously there are better off people within that group and people who are okay and other people who are distinctly poor. But one of the things you do not often see actually is minority older persons using the bus. And I used to be involved very heavily in a local voluntary sector group which provided befriending services. And most of our client group were women actually, but they were women either of Hong Kong descent or women of from Indian subcontinent. And what they were always looking for was the volunteer with the car, or it was very important that somebody in their family had a car. It wasn't just about levels of disability and perhaps greater difficulty in using a bus, though some people had those issues. It was more about issues about, I don't think I'm going to express this very well, that if your family didn't have a car, somehow you were truly poor. Even if you didn't have a lot of money, if somebody could drive you somewhere, that was it was important that somebody could drive their mother, somebody could rely upon their son or their daughter to drive them somewhere. Those things seem to be very important, that sense of personal independent mobility rather than using a public service. Now, I don't know whether if those ideas are much more found in the north or indeed simply within Newcastle. And I suspect those people who live in larger cities or Sheila in London, the experience might look rather different.
Well, it's certainly, if I could add in there, it's certainly true. I mean, it is so multicultural that actually it's more likely to be people like myself as white British who are not using the bus. And yet, how foolish is that? Because the access in London is terrific on the bus, and I've had to learn the system. But that's not to say, I mean, I think some of the other things as we come out that are more COVID related are to do with households and who has access and who you can enable to join you in a car. I know I went to meet somebody on Monday, but that was walking, but I swim. Sorry, this is a roundabout route of saying let's have swimming back on the agenda. But I mean, which is, but she said to me, I could take you, but I can't take you. I can tell you where to go in, the other side of London to swim outdoors in some public schools lake or whatever. And I thought, gosh, this is really complicated. But those are things that are very related to the current situation, and hopefully they'll change. But I think certainly the ownership of buses is open to everyone. There we get back to the Freedom Pass. Actually, that's more likely to be something that people from all cultural groups are campaigning against, because that's what gives you that access. So we certainly don't have that feeling as you've just expressed there, rows of different groups not using buses. I mean, certainly it's more likely to be, as I said, the opposite.
I just come in there with a comment because there's been some good discussion on there from I think Amy started off and some others have been involved there, and it comes down to the same thing really, that actually, and Angela and I wrote about this in our book, quick plug there for our book, but it's very important, the geography of transport, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether you're looking at that from, you know, which perspective in geography, but geographies is absolutely important to the way transport runs, whether that's the social side, the cultural side, but also the physical side. So every bit makes a huge difference. So what you find in one place, you can't adapt to another, and some of that's because of the socio-economic background, some of that's because of the actual physical geography of the landscape. So in some respects, what we're seeing at the moment with a kind of pop-up solution to things might be part of the way forward. You know, if you are able to adapt your service, whether that's a bus service or whether that's putting in infrastructure for a cycle lane or for an extra pavement at the moment, then, and that works to some extent, then that might be the way to do it, and then you adapt again, because at the moment it is also much put in place that is there forever or for a long period of time. And as we can see, especially with the current situation, things change daily, and we need to adapt and make sure we make the most of it. Otherwise people get excluded from that and get excluded for long periods of time, I think. So, and it's just like we said on the chat a bit there, that, you know, what's right in Swansea is very different to what happens in Bristol or what happens in Newcastle, and let alone what happens in other countries and other cultures as a result of this. So transport's always very, very localized. So the solutions need to be.
Great. Thanks, Charles, and everyone else. We've gone slightly over time, and I think I just wanted to check with the chat. Are there any other points that people wanted to make or burning questions? I think we've raised quite a lot. There's a lot kind of out there, and there's been some enthusiasm for looking at some joint research approaches, which is something that the special interest groups are very keen to promote. So yeah, if there aren't any further questions, then I was going to suggest we have a 10-minute comfort break before we come back, and please do come back for an informal discussion about